Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining the Product People Weekly Meetup. We are excited to once again bring you some of the latest and greatest in product knowledge that we get to share with you, our community, in the hopes of helping everyone improve their product management skills and to spread knowledge generously. Today, we're going to be speaking with Adelina Cristovao from Wolt, talking about product localization and localizing the digital experience, something that I've had experience with personally, and I'm excited to learn more about best practices when it comes to localization. A little bit about me, I'm John Freeman. I am an Associate Product Manager 2 at Product People. Prior to Product People, I had done some product management for a company called Eco ATM, as well as Outerwall, a large holding company that included Redbox and Coinstar. Also done project management, and I did spend a year in consultative sales in between my product management positions, trying to assess that world just a little bit. And I'm also an MBA from UCLA, so go Bruins. But that's enough about me for today. For those of you not familiar, if this is your first time joining us, Product People is an organization that provides consultative services for product management, or for companies that are seeking interim product managers, in-house product management, acting as interim. So in the event that your organization has a gap in your product management team, be it because of a parental leave, perhaps there's a long lead time between your previous product manager leaving and your new product manager being able to begin, or perhaps you're in a phase of your company's growth where hiring a full-time person doesn't necessarily make sense, and having a consultant there acting in that role as an interim position does make a bit more sense, then we're the right organization for you. We are not freelancers. We all work for Product People directly. So you're getting Product People as a service, as opposed to hiring just me. You're hiring a team of us that helps with your product management practices. So in the event that somebody is sick or has to take vacation or so on, the wheels keep spinning, the train keeps moving, we keep progressing. In addition to that, we do have a product management community, which is what you're attending today, where we try to spread knowledge generously by providing new insights that we've learned from not only our practices working as consultants, but from community members and wonderful people in the product community that are willing to share best practices and the new knowledge that they've generated in their day-to-day. Before the talk begins, we want to get to know you just a little bit and prime you for the conversation today. We're going to pop up a poll in just a moment. And if you could just take a few seconds here to answer the poll, that would be fantastic. Okay. So the poll questions today: where should the ideal localization workflow actually begin? And what is the most relevant element in the user interface that should be localized? Just give a few more seconds and then we'll go ahead and stop the poll. We stopped it, yeah, Hannah? Okay. All right, so if you can see the result, we have 50% says that UX design is where the ideal localization should actually begin, and 50% suggests that strategy is where we want to begin. And then what is the most relevant element in the user interface that should be localized? And everyone agrees it's everything. Everything, everything, everything. And of course, that is exactly the right answer. At least I think. Okay. Awesome. And so with that, again, I want to thank Adelina Cristovao for joining us. I'm very excited for this presentation. And with that, Adelina, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so then you can take over the presentation.
Hey, thank you very much. Great answers, everybody, and hello. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Adelina. Very excited to be talking about this topic today. Happy to see there is interest in the localization topic connected to product management. So this is super great. Currently, I'm working at Wolt since 1 year, more or less, serving as a product localization lead, but starting to touch also other aspects of localization because product cannot be done alone. There's other things also to consider. So at Wolt, we are building a program and a system, and this is what I'm doing at the moment. Before Wolt, I was actually doing something similar but completely different for Trivago. Spent more or less 6 years there, a bit less than 6 years. And before actually stepping over to the buyer side, I was on the seller side, learning also from that perspective. And my career started as a localization expert, so I was a translator as well, among some other roles within the language, the wider language industry. So I've been spending my entire professional and adult life within the language and localization industry, which is unexpected, I guess. I'm not sure. One never knows what happens in the beginning. Cool. Today, I would like to discuss the topic of localization, and I would like to focus on this very single point of the process. And I will start to share my screen. Tick, tick, tick. So you can see my screen?
Yes, we can. Awesome.
Perfect. Okay, cool. Thanks for the feedback. Okay. Focusing on the, 1 second, please, because now I lost my screen. Great. Oh, here it is. Okay. Okay, so the digital user experience. This is my focus today, and it has been my focus for quite some time. It seems to be like a very basic thing to have, but I actually believe this is the key to success. The digital user experience is what we actually localize, and we need to do it in collaboration with a big and a varied group of stakeholders. So that's why I call it the multi-stakeholder path to success. I'm going to talk a little bit, very shortly mention what localization is, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Then which elements can actually be localized, and I guess you already know this because you got it all right in the quiz. Then the process from a top-level perspective and the stakeholders, how this connects with product management, because this is a product community, and what actually the common goal is. So, localization is a way to adapt the user experience to local markets. It is not translation. Sometimes it gets used interchangeably, but basically translation is a part of localization. So translation is just the way to transform source text into text in another language, whereas localization looks at the user experience as a whole and from a global perspective. So in order to look at and understand localization from a full perspective, one needs to actually understand the user experience, the elements that constitute it, and what it actually means to adjust. It is true that text or copy or content is most times the element that is most likely focused on and also most widely used as the element to be localized. But if we take a step back and take a look at the user experience as a whole, or at the user journey as a whole, which is even a step further back, then one finds that there is more potential to actually create a global or international user experience for the company's users that could drive more value. And that's why I focus on the flow, because the flow, the process of adjusting or making that adaptation of the user experience to versions, similar versions or comparable versions of that user experience into other languages and for other cultures, is where we can actually retrieve more value for the business that we are trying to support with that adaptation. And that's why the process is where I have focused quite some time, because this is where I see that sometimes it doesn't really work. So going back to the user experience, the localizable elements are all within the UX design. So some of them are explicit, some of them are implicit. We're going to take a look at this a little bit further down the presentation. But all of these elements can be localized. Some of them really need to be localized. So like I said before, the text is an obvious candidate. It actually needs to be localized all the time. So it means it needs to be translated or transcreated, which is much more of an adaptation than translation itself. Other elements need to be internationalized in the code. So there is an adaptation of the code, and others are there that are not localized at all. So the version is always the same for all of the markets, and there are implicit information, and some of you mentioned strategy in the beginning of the localization, and that was not incorrect, because those are the implicit elements in design that can be adapted to a different market as well. Localization needs to adjust to design, yes, but also design needs to consider this need to adapt when design is happening, and when the creation of the journey is happening, and when the concept of the experience is happening. It can also be that the user experience in the end looks slightly different than the original. It could be that it looks completely different than the original, and that this is what is needed in order for the experience that was adapted to serve the exact same business purpose as the original one. So this means, in fact, that yes, UX design with all the elements that influence it is the beginning of the localization process. This is where the localization process starts, but it needs to have implicit elements like the business, like the strategy elements attached to it. So kudos to you who said UX design and strategy. I would say both are correct, or at least needed at the same time. Cool. So the localizable elements, I see them as being three. We have the cultural elements, the layout, so the purely layout elements, and then also the text, so the content or the copy elements. Whereas the cultural, we need to look at our business goals, but also local specific preferences, like, for example, visual preferences, size of images, or even the relationship between images and text. It doesn't need to be always the same across cultures. The color and its symbology can also change and can also be adjusted if we know about that. The way communication is created, meaning that, for example, for some cultures, we need to add more context. Some others like a more lean communication, so less context around it. And also how different people in different countries make their decisions. So these are things that we can consider when going into different markets, and that we could potentially adjust or adapt to those markets, so to adapt the preferences to the people that actually live there and use the product. Same goes for the user interface. Also images, color, text, obviously, text orientation. This is also kind of obvious. Dates, currency, spacing, which is what we generally talk about within the internationalization discipline. But then we have font size, image size, emojis, if used. And who knows, Wolt knows that emojis are heavily used at Wolt, so yes. Symbols, layout generally speaking, so where the things are put within the image, and the length of the language, so character limitations, probably you've heard of this as well. This is also important, otherwise the user interface might break if the target language is too long. This is a simple example. The message, definitely then, yes, then we go into the realms of translation or even transcreation, wording, language length, the intention, context, and then these typical things like pluralization, personalization, tone of voice, style, currency, time, date, format, symbol, string. So you see, there's a lot of things that one can consider, and all of these elements that can or should are dependent on the decision. The decision can be driven from the strategy. So if one knows the strategy for entering the countries, we can make specific decisions for all of these elements and decide we will adapt, we will not adapt. And also, obviously, according to the target country where we're going in, if it's closer to the one that we are leaving or not so close culturally speaking, then we might want to adjust more or less, given, or obviously it's all being dependent on the teams having enough capacities to deal with this level of complexity, or at least to adjust the level of complexity to the capacities within the team. Level of complexity can grow and develop in time as well. I will not focus more on these elements because today I wanted to focus on the process. But if you have questions later in Q&A, I'm more than happy to take them. And I didn't bring an example also for that reason. So I'm jumping right now over to the localization process. So why do I focus on the localization process? I focus on it exactly because of what I said before. It is the team's capacities and the level of collaboration that allows for success in the previous considerations. So we cannot do localization properly just as a team that works alone. The most important thing in order to make this adaptation of the user experience is the collaboration between the many stakeholders that touch the user experience, basically. So localization team is the team that then picks up whatever was decided before and finds the best solutions and strategies to make the adaptation. But the localization team is not the one making the decisions for the adaptation. This needs to come before. So when localization is done as an afterthought in the end, and we just get a couple of requirements, then obviously questions arise. And if there are no people in the beginning of the process to either explain, clarify, or even make adjustments that need to be done in order for localization to be able to work, then the output is not as good as it could be. So this means that the success of localization is highly dependent on the success of the collaboration of all of the stakeholders before. That's why this is the focus of my work, basically, because in the companies that I've worked for, I noticed that when collaboration increased and improved, so when there was more alignment, more communication, more proactiveness, the result, the output of the localization process or effort also improved. And this is in the end what drives the business for the company on an international level. So it is relevant to look at the stakeholders so that everybody knows who is actually touching aspects of the experience or of the design that can and should be localized, so that we make these decisions before, and that we make them in a way that is not stressful or adds pressure, or that removes the autonomy of the teams that work in product, where high value is generally that there is a lot of autonomy, a lot of independency in making decisions. So without jeopardizing this, it would be important to reflect a bit on this in each use case and understand what can be done so that each stakeholder knows about the others and what we should do in order to make an adaptation. So this is just an example, very top level of a flow. The stakeholders here that I have identified, generally speaking, are definitely product management, developers, but then also UX design, content design, which is very important, UX copywriters that may or may not be. So a company either has content design, UX copyright, sometimes both. So it's like, basically it's the people that design the content. Strategy, here it is. Then the localization, generally speaking, which is basically a manager, project manager, and a group of translators or linguists. And then we have consumers, which, yes, are a very important stakeholder of localization because they are the final user. So when there is a new idea for a new feature coming from product management and developers do their thing. I called it like this because sometimes it's a bit specific, but then somehow this idea comes towards the user design team that start designing the experience together with the PMs and the devs. At the same time, ideally, there is an alignment from the beginning with content design to decide where content should go, how should the tone of voice be, what style should we use for this specific thing, how big, how small, how long, and so on and so forth, following the identity, the brand book. All of these things are decided with content design. So the UX design and content design together create the final design, because they will decide where the different elements will go. Business strategy at this point is probably not in the room, but is present through a documentation or through a set of requirements or decisions that had been done before. For example, if there is a globalization team. So all of this should flow in this design, combined design between the layout and content. Then it can go into localization, because everything has been decided and set between design, content, product managers and developers. Strategy flew in, and then we can send this into a localization flow that has previously also decided on the best strategies or on the best solutions. Can we do machine translation? Should we do human? Should we do a combination of both? Should we transcreate more? Should we just translate? What is the best approach for the specific business goal? And these things have been considered before, and then it just goes into the machine, basically. So in the localization machine, where the miracles happen, things get adjusted. If we are talking about copy, which is many times the typical situation, so text would get adapted here, go back to merging, then product would receive equivalent user experience to the original one. This is then what we would see in the pre-release. And then the experiences are released, basically. And then comes the last and maybe one of the most important stakeholders, which are the consumers. So they carry a stake in how we actually adapt the experience for them. Ideally, we would have a flow where not only the consumers are exposed, but they are somehow able to provide feedback, that we are able to collect this feedback and somehow make it flow back into the feature development process and into the design and content design process. So all of this feedback would be collected, and like this, we would have a continuous flow where the experience is continuously created, confronted, and tested with the final consumer, allowing us, so in the company, to continuously improve what we are offering, and hopefully find the best experience for the users that we are serving in the way that it is delightful, so that we are not only serving the users' needs, but giving them something that they actually want, that they feel joy and experience good feelings when they are exposed to what we created. So this would be the ultimate goal, because only then we will have consumers that come back because they want to, because they had an experience and they enjoyed it. They want to work with this product because they like it, not because they need it. It's just great to use it. So that would be the ultimate goal of this process. And the better the collaboration is between the product management, developers, content design, user experience, obviously the part of the globalization or the strategy, and then the localization team and the localization person, the more we align and collaborate, the better the output can be. And this is where I really see the value being added through the localization team as well. Often the collaboration is not there ideally in an ideal way. There is a tendency to work, like I said before, in silos. And what I'm defending is not that localization becomes so centralized that it becomes a gatekeeper. Nothing is possible without a lot of alignment and proactiveness and communication. But for the sake of a good adaptation of the user experience, or for the creation of multiple versions of one product version to adjust to multi-market, I believe this should be the approach. I'm not sure how we are in terms of time, but I think we're more or less okay. Cool. So why is this important to product management? Why should product management consider UX and localization in order to be successful? Because localization creates the multi-market product, basically. So product management creates one version, the original, and then through the localization system, there is a product created in several versions that should meet different markets or different users, because the success of a multi-market product depends on the way it is localized. So it's not enough to just, let's say, machine translate everything. That would not be most likely the best approach. There should be some cultural relevance in it, and also the consideration of the other elements. So it's important that product management is involved in localization decisions, because if product management actually influenced the initial experience, which it obviously did, it should also influence how it is adapted. And for that, it is sometimes necessary, or maybe it's relevant at some point, that the disciplines of UX, so design, content design, and also localization become more closer to the product manager's environment, that the product manager is actually curious and able to align with these teams in order to better decide and define how the multi-market versions of its product should actually look like, what needs it should cover, and what ways it has to be really delightful for users. So in this case, form and function should somehow coexist, making the product manager not only a stakeholder, but a really interested stakeholder in localization, and understanding how it could best use for how localization can serve the product best, but also how product management can support localization in their efforts. So yeah, that's I guess that's my message today. Care about localization, because we all share a common goal. Everybody that I just discussed shared the common goal of providing a delightful global user experience that drives business. So this is what, in the end, from my perspective, everybody wants, and everybody wants to achieve. And when it comes to global, we can best achieve it by working more closely together to achieve this. Yeah, and thank you very much. For me, this was quite the monologue.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen again, but that was fantastic. I definitely have questions.
Yeah.
But at the moment, I am going
I can
to share
stop sharing.
my
I can
screen.
stop sharing.
There we go. All right, and we should be able to see my screen again. I hope that's the case. Okay. Awesome, awesome, awesome. So again, thank you. I know I have my questions. I'm assuming some of our audience members have questions as well. Regardless of which platform that you're on, be it YouTube, be it LinkedIn, however you are watching this, if you're on the Zoom call, feel free to enter into your questions into your chat box, and we're going to consolidate those questions, and I'll ask those questions on your behalf. While we're collecting those questions, I'm going to give you a bit more information about Product People. As I had stated previously, we're a product management consultancy firm, and what we do is we act as interim product managers in the event that your product team is in between product managers, so to speak. Let's say your product manager goes on a parental leave. Let's say that they have there's a long time for your lead process to be able to actually find the appropriate product manager to fill that role. Well, in that interim period, we step in and we actually do the day-to-day operations of the product management organization. We are product management as a service. What that means is, you're not just getting me, but you're actually getting me plus a buddy and somebody that's overseeing us from a supervisory perspective to ensure that your goals and objectives are being met. And as we bring in best practices to your organization, that we're doing so in a manner that ensures that the train keeps moving and that your products are getting delivered. We also offer coaching and consultation. We've collected a ton of product knowledge that we would love to help share with you and your organization to help you set up best practices. And we also do product discovery to help you get from 0 to 1. What we're not doing, we're not recruiters. We're not a freelance marketplace. If you work for Product People, you are an employee of Product People. Again, it's part of our product management as a service. That means if any one person is no longer available for illness or whatever the reason may be, we're able to backfill immediately. And we're not a development or design agency. but we're willing to work with your developers and designers as needed. Here's some examples of our B2C clients. You may have heard of some of them. We're talking micromobility. There's Tier on the list. I know I use Blinkist because I don't always have the time to read a whole book. B2B clients, some that you may have seen, including the WHO. We get a lot of positive feedback. People seem to like working with us. I can't imagine why, but they seem to enjoy the work that we do, and we're very proud of the work that we do and the feedback that we receive. Another thing that we're very proud of is we have a lot of female-led leadership, 66% leadership of female in the team, which is pretty cool. We are all smiling, happy, beautiful people. Don't you want to work with us? We look great. And we're hiring in particular for our associate positions, but please feel free. We'll put the link in the chat later, but feel free to check us out to see if this is an organization that you're interested in working for. Okay, and with that being said, we'll start with the Q&A. All right, and so I've got a bunch of questions myself, so as the questions are coming in from the organization, I'll just start. So something that I was noticing when you were going through your process is it seemed not necessarily linear in the sense that you did have the feedback loop that was bringing you back to the initial point, but something that I'm curious about is in particular when it comes to the strategy element of this. When you're investigating which new locations, which new countries, which new cultures, so to speak, to launch your product into, there might be some business rationale for doing that from a purely economic perspective. And yet, when you get into the nitty-gritty in terms of the actual what needs to happen in terms of localizing the product, I can envision there may be some hiccups that might mess with those economic figures, so to speak. And so I'm wondering if, within your experience, how important is it to get the localization team involved in that strategy process such that you're not making commitments to launch into markets which may not necessarily fit within the product as it is, or maybe too extreme of a change to justify entering into that market?
Yep, thank you for that question. It's a good question. I would definitely argue that it would make sense to involve localization as soon as there's a decision or there is maybe not a decision, but when new countries are being considered and there might be a short list, I would reach out to localization and understand if a company is consumer centric and really wants to make a very local experience for the users, it makes definitely sense to bring localization in and ask, if we want to become very local for these users in this country, how big is the effort? How big is the cultural gap between what we are doing up to this point? So the way the product is actually built and the features are being built and the layout, the user experience, the context, the communication, how we assume that users make decisions. How big is the gap between what we're doing and what we would like to do in order to keep this very customer-centric and this very local approach? If it's a country that has a very different culture than the ones that the company is already working in, then it might be a bigger effort to create more adaptations on more of the elements that I just mentioned before. And in that case, it's worth deciding if that kind of investment for the kind of return that is expected. Yeah.
Awesome. And as a follow-up to that, I see Carolyn from I believe that's the Zoom chat, says, does the budget ever limit or influence the localization goals, and how do you manage that? I think it's a good question to ask immediately after that.
Yeah, it is a good question. It is a great question. Money always influences everything, so it also influences localization, definitely. So yeah, the budget limits. Imagine I would go into a meeting like this and somebody would ask, I would say, yeah, sure. we can be hyper local in a country that is completely opposite culturally wise from the ones that we are in. We can definitely do it, but we would need to invest more. And then obviously it's not my decision, but somebody would need to release extra budget in order to do it. If not, then I would say, well, then what we could do with the budget that we currently have is this and this. We will not take it so close in terms of hyper local, but we will have like this middle ground, and then it's just a decision as well. So basically, if I fought for a budget and I got a budget, then I will need to manage the budget in a similar way than how I argued to get the budget, right? But if it goes outside of that and we want to do extra, then I would then fight for more budget or provide a solution based on the budget that we have with previous transparency about that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Did this answer?
I hope it did for the person that asked, but I think it did for me, certainly. So I appreciate the answer. I'm curious about the product branching into multiple versions and managing those multiple versions over time. Now, our goal obviously would be to try and stay on the same platform as best as we can and make as little tweaks as possible, right? Because the less tweaks that you have, the less that you have to manage. But I can envision there's extreme cultural changes between location 1 and location 2, which might have products that look essentially like completely different products as a consequence. Now, how do you manage and contend with these various branching product lines, if you will, and especially when it comes to prioritization of new features and how best to utilize your resources effectively?
Yeah, that's also a good question and definitely a concern whenever this topic comes up. I don't think that completely different versions are actually desired by a product company. I would not necessarily suggest that. It's something that can be done, but probably shouldn't, also because of identity a bit of the brand. But what I would suggest to do is that, so there's always a way of grouping countries, not trying to get into any cliches or anything, but people have a lot of similarities, thankfully, so we are not so different in many things. So what I would propose is that we try to group the countries in the similarities, have a similar approach for those similarities in terms of the product features, experience, layout, all of this, and then understand what the differentiating factors are really valuable and relevant and focus on those. And then have a system. So then we would need to work with a process that is able to serve this kind of differentiation. Obviously, that's where the complexity really kicks in. But if we have support from a good tool, automation, and also a lot of documentation, documenting what needs to be done when and what, and beginnings of processes are well established as well, I think it can be done to create differentiation between different countries in a way that is not too much of a burden, and where the maintenance of the countries doesn't become a huge and a very expensive process. Yeah.
Absolutely. Good answer. Try to avoid too much variation if possible, I think is the key here if we can. Or too much expensive variation, I guess I could say.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that's what we've been doing so far, right? I think that so far we're trying to avoid a lot of variation, because we are afraid of the complexity. What I'm saying is that we should not be afraid of this complexity, because people like me are probably able to manage it, and we should be given the chance to do it. So believe in the localization professionals and hand them over this responsibility of actually managing this complexity, because I think we can, and serve the company better and the product better. We just need to be smart about the kind of variation and how we actually make it happen.
Right. Awesome. I think this is a good piggyback on to that. It might help us influence, the decision-making process, so to speak. Are there any KPIs or success measures specific to localization to measure effect for the good versus the great localization? And how do you know when it is enough to achieve that strategy?
Yeah, this is a very good question as well. Thank you for all of these great questions. So I've been thinking, obviously, about this metric a lot, because also here we can have a lot of we can have a lot of complexity. But in order to make it easy to communicate what we can do and what the value is that we add, I would, at this point of my experience, suggest that we have only one to measure this, and this is just the user satisfaction. And with user satisfaction, I don't mean the internal users, I mean actually the external consumers. So I would find a way of measuring their satisfaction. And unless, if we are a customer-centric company and we want to really delight people, if this is a strategy and we want them to return because they like to come back, then the level needs to be very high, right? So the threshold, if we are measuring from 0 to 10, it should be something like 9 or above. So yeah, I would just do this. All of the rest is the basic, right? So the LQAs and all of the reviews and the second pair of eyes, this is all super relevant and necessary, but it's already become a basic. This needs to be there in any situation. And then it's just a matter of finding what is that we are doing that really delights people out there, and let it flow into our process. Thank you. Thank you for this question. It is hard to sell, definitely, definitely. That's why I think about this so much, because I keep thinking about how to sell this. Because I think that people like me, like people in my job, they feel that this is so obvious.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Customers love you, they want to come back. It makes sense.
Yeah.
How do you mitigate risks and delays in such a non-linear process? This is coming from Magdalene on LinkedIn. I'm especially thinking of a situation when a company is using external LSPs. Forgive me, I don't know what that stands for.
It's a language service provider. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know what that is.
Yeah.
But LSP. As a translator and localizer, I can imagine so many emergencies on the way to success.
Yes, thank you. I also like this question. Yeah, I would, and I do. I bet on everything on my process. So there are 3 things that you need in order to make it work. And please remember that I generally work as a single person team. So I don't have like a huge team that supports me. It's like me and everything that I can come up with. So what I found out to help me doing this is that I need to have a good translation management tool, so TMS, a good TMS, and good is very subjective. So each one can find the one that somehow suits best. Then we need to really find a good LSP, and there are some good out there. So there are a couple of things that we really need to have from an LSP, and these things should not be debatable. So you would know what you need in order to make it work and ask your LSP to provide this. And then if you have this, you are able to build a process that should be able to stop these things from happening. So a process that is automatized. Technology is our friend. So you need to figure out how to make the connections, the integrations, and make everything flow, like have this highway for the content, have centralized interface for accessing the content and having it flow over to the LSP, and negotiating with the LSP everything that you need the LSP to deliver in order to make it work, including an SLA that meets your needs, and they can. So my SLA is always 24 hours, and sometimes I add 24 to 48, but I don't. So everything that is below, let's say 300 words, needs to be delivered extremely quickly, and this should be a typical expectation. For example, I'm not sure if this answered. I'm happy to answer a follow-up question if necessary for this participant and for this answer.
As we wait for that to come in, I'll go ahead and ask something else. Yeah, you touched on the idea of grouping countries. I think everybody might consider DACH, Deutschland, Austria, so on, as a grouping, as a key example for us living in Europe. But I'm just genuinely curious, have you found in your experience anything that might be universally accepted, meaning regardless of where you go in the world, there's some sort of, maybe it's a color palette or schema that is ultimately representative of the same thing, or a certain type of user experience where you could just plug and play anywhere in the globe and you're not going to have to localize? Is that possible?
Interesting question. Maybe I've never thought of that in that perspective. At this point, I would actually say no, which obviously doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And there's a lot of assumptions from a lot of orgs out there that go into this direction, that what we have in common is stronger than what separates us. I like this thought. But I also feel that we generally like to be spoken in a way that is familiar and comfortable to us. And when we are asked to adjust to something that is not familiar, that this is an effort that we might not be asked to do if there's more proximity in terms of things. Obviously, if you look at a brand like Nike or obviously Apple, or all of these big, they found a way of communicating with everybody. And if I would try to put that in one bag, I would say simplicity. Whatever that means, right? Simplicity is probably also defined differently in different cultures. But simplicity, I think, is like a common language that everybody appreciates, looking at those examples. But I guess it's something to keep thinking about.
Answer in Apple, you just reminded me of an example that is leading me to my next question. An example of where Apple has had to localize is in Japan, where because of a law, they have to, every time the camera goes off, it has to make a clicking sound. There's a law that says the cameras have to do that. So there's a legal requirement in order for them to localize. Where in your process does the legal team get involved so that when you're entering into new markets, you're not caught with some of these gotcha scenarios that require a change in order to enter into that market?
Yeah, that's very relevant as well. I didn't put them in the stakeholder panel, but maybe I should have, because they should be right there in the beginning. Yeah, right there in the beginning, when copy is being written, definitely. When the layout is being tested, then legal should be consulted or confronted with like the experience being created, and feedback should be collected. So when this is live and then suddenly legal has a comment, it's too late.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I've got one last fun question, and then we're going to begin wrapping this up. What is the most extreme example that you've experienced in a change that was required for entering into a new market?
Could you repeat? I'm sorry, I was just reading a comment.
Yeah, no, I'm just curious about like what may be the most extreme example of entering into a new market or a territory where you were caught by surprise because of how different the requirement ultimately was relative to the base product.
I would so I would say Japan or even China. Those countries would be a very good example of what not to do. So if we are going into a new market with the same product that we developed for USA, then just let's not do it going into Japan, China, or even Korea, because people that live there definitely like things done differently, and we should do that before we go into there, learning what we could do in order to make it a better experience for them. So yeah.
Great. No, not a specific, but a general answer that I think everybody on this call can use and learn from. And with that, we are at time for this week's Product People event. We appreciate everybody joining us. Adelina, we would appreciate it if you stayed back. We've got some questions for you just between Hannah and myself. And folks on the call, thank you again for joining us. You can find more information about us, Hannah, if you have the links available. About Product People, about the events that we're going to be doing in the future. We have links to our meetup. If you would like to connect with me, you're more than welcome to do so via LinkedIn, and that link should be here as well coming up in the chat. But in the meantime, we thank you for joining. And again, Adelina Cristovao from Wolt, fantastic presentation, great session, great Q&A. I learned a lot. And thank you very, very much. There's the links, and we'll see you all again in the future, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming and for listening and for asking questions. It was a big pleasure being here. Thanks so much for having me.